And this year we'll be running the fifth cohort. But most importantly, the graduates that come or that churned out of this particular school are really, really serving in very, very critical positions in their countries and others in regional organizations.
Thank you very much for joining us on today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. In our virtual studio, we have Mr. Charles Mongi. He is a head of program and research at the Pan-African Climate Justice and Alliance in Kenya. We are going to be discussing various issues regarding the organizational operation, the activities the organization is undertaking in Kenya, in East Africa, and in Africa. We are going to be diving into all of these issues. But before we turn the platform over to the guests, I want you all to please be a supporter of this channel. Mr. Charles Mongi, thank you very much for being here today on Unpopular Opinion. And what inspired you to get into climate justice? Why do you think this is important for Africa and Kenya?
So thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you for having me in your show. And on behalf of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, I really want to thank you and your show for finding time to engage with us in this conversation. So my name, like you have put it, I'm Charles Mongi. I work as a head of programs and research at Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, or PACJA, is one of the largest really coalition that brings together civil society actors in Africa that are focusing on climate justice advocacy. We came to be in 2008, and we have spread our tentacles across 54 countries in Africa, where we have active platforms carrying on, climate justice advocacy at country level and also at regional and global levels. Now, climate change is a reality that has hit the continent of Africa more than any other place. And it's quite disheartening to hear that there are people, that we call climate deniers that have come to be. And of course, they are against the fact that climate change is there and that it's impacting, societies, economies, and people. But the African continent, even though we only contribute 4% of total greenhouse gases emissions, we are suffering the adverse impacts more than anybody else. If you look at what has been happening in the southern part of Africa, particularly Malawi and Mozambique, where cyclones, have become order of the day, and many people, have lost their lives, their livelihoods, their farms, their houses, their relatives, these impacts really cannot sometimes even be quantified. And the Horn of Africa has experienced, droughts. For example, last year, but we had the worst drought, in 40 years. And I think last year again, in the Horn of Africa, we also experienced serious, floods. Like in Kenya, we lost probably close to 300 people, and maybe some people remain unaccounted for. So therefore, the impacts of climate change are real, and the continent of Africa is experiencing this impact more than anybody else. And this is really what underpins our mandate and our pursuit, for climate justice in the continent of Africa. And this organization came to be upon realization that we have to tell our story. We have to tell the African narrative from where we sit and based on our own context. Our story cannot be told by anybody else, because they say the wearer of the shoe is the one who knows where it pinches most. And therefore, we work with a diversity of stakeholders. We have indigenous people, we have women groups, we have youth groups, we have faith communities, private sector players, SMEs, and many other, diversity really of organizations, but all of them, focusing on climate and justice in this continent.
Today's video is probably sponsored by Magnite to the brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them on their Instagram page or on their website. All of the links are in the description of this video. I want us to talk about the organizational mission. You've already spoken about the organizational mission, the objectives, and the key partners, which are some of the stakeholders, such as SMEs and other civil society organizations across the continent. You also talk about you are represented in 54 states across the African continent. So what are some of the most impactful work that your organization has undertaken in recent years, and why do you think that project was essential for the climate sector in Africa?
Um, I should say that PACJA is guided by a strategy, and our strategy has got 5 strategic objectives. Now, the first strategic objective is on resilient, growth, which is really one of our biggest, strategic objective. And under this, of course, we focus mostly on building resilience, particularly of communities that we call frontline communities. And these are communities that are mostly impacted by climate change. And we actually are some of the proponents of what we call the principles of local-related climate actions, where we believe that climate action must happen more than anywhere else on the ground where these communities are. But the biggest challenge is that climate finance that is supposed to support resilience building really does not necessarily reach the communities at the grassroots. And you realize that out of 100% that would actually come to Africa, only about 10% of those resources really reaches the ground where the communities are. And therefore, in that regard, we work, of course, through our national platforms, which really anchor our work in the 54 countries to ensure that we're able to reach those communities that are mostly impacted in different ways. One, of course, we function as that particular platform, which gives them an opportunity, to voice their concerns and really to also contribute to solutions that they would think actually would work for their region. Because the same communities we are talking about being impacted are the same communities that really understand the solutions that would actually make sense, to them. So therefore, we provide that platform where these voices and the voices that we call the voices of the voiceless are amplified, until they reach the decision-making, bodies, whether it is at country level, at government level, whether it's at regional level, and that is in institutions like the African Union and at the global level, particularly when we participate in these global convenings like the conference and of parties. But most importantly, we have also been learning on the ground, resilience, initiatives through an initiative that we call Climate Justice Impact Fund. And this is a small grant, a fund that is really focusing on funding the unfundable. Mostly whenever you are asking or developing proposals targeting, climate finance fraud, we are normally told that we have to develop bankable proposals. And whoever defines, the bankable proposals can only be, the person who is actually making the grant. And therefore, you realize that there are these communities who don't have that particular capacity to develop what is referred to as bankable, proposals. Yet these communities have ideas and ideas that would directly, impact communities that live near them. And they have solutions, simple solutions, but that resonate with the communities that they work with or where they live. And therefore, we have been able to issue so many small grants, to women groups, to youth groups, and there is amazing kind of work that is happening at that particular level, and we are contributing in a big way in terms of building resilience of communities at that particular level. Beyond that, of course, we do engage in dialogues because we provide forum for dialogue where we bring a diversity of stakeholders. In this regard, of course, we work very closely with governments, but we also work very closely with the African Union Commission. We work closely with United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, the Pan-African Parliament, and other regional parliaments. We work with regional economic communities, and for some of them, of course, we have studying MOUs. And for AUC, and UNECA, and of course, FDB, we are together within what we call the crime dev, partnership, and crime dev was actually sanctioned, by African side of state. And APAC normally sits, of course, as a civil society, partner in that regard. And together we are able to do or convene a number of regional dialogues, including what we call most stakeholder consultations, that happens, at the Silence of African Union Summit, for us to review the previous COP, and of course to work on strategies for the COPs that are way ahead, that are actually ahead. For instance, last year we held one to review the outcomes of COP28, but again to strategize for COP29. We will be hosting yet another one, reviewing the outcomes of COP29, but again laying, the structures and strategies are for COP30, which will be happening later in Berem this year. Now, we have other, of course, regional convenings, including African regional forum on sustainable development, where we also anchor our work. We have African Ministerial Conference on Environment, where we're always present and we run side events at the side events of that important conference. We also co-create climate change and development for Africa conference together with other crime partners, which happens again every year, and a diversity of other regional convenings. And through those convenings, where we always generate some statement, we go a long way in terms of informing processes. Sometimes we do organized loss and damage conferences, like we've done so in the last 3 years consecutively, again, raising the voices of the voiceless, and to ensure that whenever then we sit in decision-making bodies, then we're able to influence, the outcome of such convenings like COP and other important convenings. But we also have another strategic objective, which is public mobilization. And of course, in this case, we work with a diversity of stakeholders, but most importantly, our young people. And within this strategic objective, there is one critical initiative which we run, and we call it the Nairobi Summer School on climate justice. Now, this is a phenomenal sort of initiative where we bring together young people from Africa and from actually all the 54 countries in the continent. And the program is not even attracting young people beyond Africa. And we put them in a university for 2 weeks. And for those 2 weeks, we have a diversity of professors, not just academic professors, but even professors of practice from a diversity of fields, whether it is on energy, whether it is on gender, whether it is on water, whether it's on health. And we're able to really come up with a curriculum that, or we take them through a curriculum really that shapes, the next, crop of activists or climate change activists in the continent, or should I say, actors in that particular space. So far, we've done 4 cohorts, and this year we'll be running the 5th cohort. But most importantly, the graduates that come or that churned out of this particular school are really, really serving in very, very critical, positions in their countries and others in regional organizations. We have one from Djibouti called Yasin, who is now working for UNFCCC, based on her academic credentials, but that was actually boosted by the course that she did and the certificate she got from our school. We have negotiators, young negotiators, coming from different countries. We have one in Botswana, we have one in Uganda, we have one in Liberia, we have one in Mauritania, and there are quite a number that are really, really negotiating for their countries. As a result of the training that they acquired, from the Nairobi Summer School on Climate Justice. But together with that, of course, we have an initiative that we call South to South Youth Platform on Climate Justice, which is really a platform that brings together the alumni from Nairobi Summer School. And that provides a space where these young people are able to engage, they are able to talk to each other, they're able to enlighten each other on opportunities that exist. And this goes beyond Africa, like I mentioned. In the last few cohorts, actually, we have had students coming from as far as Nepal, US, Brazil. We had some again from Bhutan and several other countries that are really expressing interest in joining Philippines and so on and so forth. Meaning that it's a program that is attracting young people from far and wide. And of course, we learn many other initiatives, of course, within that strategic objective. Number three, of course, we are so much, of course, in issues of research, and issues of knowledge management, and pretty much because our advocacy is evidence-based advocacy. So we do evidence-based sort of advocacy, whereby we generate data, we generate, policy briefs, which are crucial in informing our advocacy work, because we have to remain credible, a credible organization. Our information, must be verifiable, and even as we sit with the decision makers, even as we lobby for some positions, then that is informed by scientific data derived from the research that we also do at Pacture, but again, together with other partners with whom we work with. We are also on policy influencing, which is really one of our largest way of working. And This policy influence that we do it at different levels. It starts actually from subnational jurisdiction, where we influence policies at subnational, level, at national level, and even, at continental level. At the moment, we have been negotiating and discussing with the Pan-African Parliament on the development of a model law, and that model law probably would be replicated maybe in countries across Africa, and those conversations, are ongoing. Among other interventions, climate change policies for different counties, for different districts, and influencing, of course, even development of national blueprints like the National Family Contribution documents, then the Cs, the NAPs and others. So we're in that particular space, and we really bring the community voices, in some of those strategic papers that are generated either at regional level, national, or even at national level. But again, we also track, accountability, or we demand for accountability from duty bearers. And this, of course, we have been doing for a long, long, long time. We challenge governments whenever they slip on their mandate. We challenge, of course, developed country partners, when they slip on their commitments, especially on financing, climate action, in the
Today's video is probably sponsored by Magnite Chloe Grant. If you are living in Europe or in America or in any parts of the world and you need an African tunic, you can simply check them up on the Instagram page. The link is in the description of this video. Mr. Charles Monge, being as someone who is a researcher for your organization, I would like to understand what are some of the specific rules that your organization plays in climate justice or in climate negotiations? And what are your thoughts on COP28? And what do you think is the best way forward for the African nations?
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Like I did mention, our work is largely advocacy and creating platforms through which the voiceless can be able to come on the floor, and they can actually be able to also communicate their solutions, express their feelings in terms of the impacts of climate change, but also suggest solutions that they think could actually work for them and that resonate with them and their families. But most importantly, we are very, very keen in following the COP negotiations and really influencing the conversations at global space in terms of what we want to see in the continent of Africa, in terms of justice being served. So the Paris Agreement, which was signed by majority of the countries really in the world, had very towards ensuring that the communities most impacted, get some sort of relief, through funding that would support adaptation and mitigation initiatives in the continent. What we've been pushing for is the fact that Africa needs adaptation or money for adaptation much more than anything else, simply because the impacts are already being felt, and that therefore we need our resources in terms of restoring, for example, the water systems, repairing the roads that are actually destroyed by France, building the resilience of agricultural systems, and so on and so forth. But what has been happening is that climate finance, as promised, has not been forthcoming. In 2009, in Copenhagen, countries committed to actually fund, climate change through availing, 100 billion US dollars per year up to 2020. And by the time we were hitting 2020, that money was nowhere, to be seen. So we have been tracking, of course, developed country partners to ensure that they actually honor their commitments. And party agreement also has got good provisions, that are also not honored. We pass decisions at COP, but those decisions are not necessarily implemented. But most importantly, there are several key issues we've been pushing for. And one, we have been pushing for consideration of Africa as a region with special needs and circumstances, and that is within the COP negotiations, so that that is taken as a matter of principle, and every other negotiation then takes into account and recognizes those special needs and circumstances for Africa. Why? Because the impacts are being felt in Africa. Africa is contributing risk to the greenhouse gases emissions. But again, I'm told some regions in the continent are already warming beyond the 1.5-degree threshold. And what that means is that the impacts will continue becoming worse. And IPCC, which is really that intergovernmental, body that focuses on climate change data, clearly indicates that the impacts in the continent will continue becoming worse and worse. We'll continue experiencing erratic rainfall patterns. We'll continue experiencing floods. We'll continue experiencing droughts at higher and higher and more serious magnitude. Now, the other issue that we have been pushing for, development of a new quantified, finance goal, and a goal that responds to the actual adaptation needs of the African continent. And therefore, we have been pushing for a quantum of up to 1.3 trillion US dollars per year. And that is what we've been pushing for in the last few COPs. And last year in Baku, Azerbaijan, that was a big issue that the African group of negotiators were pushing. And therefore, as PACJA, we normally push, the African group of negotiators, agenda. But what happened in Baku was nothing to smile about. In fact, we've been saying that we went hunting for an antelope, but we brought home a rodent, simply because what was agreed on was only 300 billion, US dollars, per year up to 2030. And that is way below what the needs are, because 1.3 trillion target was really based that implementation of the NDCs, the second version of NDCs by the African countries, really need about 3 trillion US dollars to implement. Implementation of NDCs alone. So even 1.3 was really a conservative, target, but several country partners, of course, opposed, that quantum. And that is why we settled on 300 billion. But even this 300 billion, the quality of that climate finance is not really exactly what we needed. It is the number of country partners and the governments that they should actually be able to deliver most of those resources. But we cannot uh, continue receiving climate funds in form of loans. So you can talk about mobilizing loans and considering loans to be part of the climate finance, that Africa needs. Why? Because African countries are already sinking in deep debts, in serious debts. And therefore, climate finance cannot come to exacerbate, the challenge, especially considering that the continent is not responsible for. So the other issue that we have actually been pushing for is, of course, finalization of what we call a GGA, or the global goal on adaptation. Whereas we have temperature goal, we haven't, had, adaptation, goal, a global goal that we can actually start with and say this is a goal that we have, for adaptation. And considering that adaptation, like I said, is really the biggest priority for the continent. As it were, climate finance that has been released so far, 75% of it goes to mitigation, only 25%. In fact, some studies indicate that that could even be worse. That those relations could be probably even worse than 25-75. And we are saying a lot of climate funds are going to mitigation, which is not a priority for the continent. And we're not saying that mitigation is not important, but adaptation really leaves us with no option but to adapt. And therefore, you need resources, towards that direction. So we have been experiencing through development of path goal, global goal for adaptation, but we're really hoping that we can be able to finalize that goal, and that the goal will be able to serve communities that we call the last mile, communities. Of course, we've been pushing also, for the countries, particularly the high middle countries, to enhance their ambition in emission cuts, because IPCC is informing us that we need to cut our greenhouse gases by a whopping 43%, in the next few years, if we are to maintain the 1.5-degree temperature goal alive. But you see, this 43% will not come from the continent of Africa. Africa, like I mentioned, is only about 4%. And even that 4% is not even equally distributed across the countries. It's only a few countries that probably account for the bigger chunk of the same. So this 43% therefore has to come from the developed country partners. We have to change our way of doing things. We must reduce the use of fossil fuels. Again, we must move away from that energy and embrace, renewable energy. We are glad to see that some countries are moving in that direction. I think a country like Norway, is producing, many more electric cars than ever before. And that trade is a trade that is commendable. And we really hope that we can quickly move through and be able to change that. Now, the tragedy we have, particularly this year, is the fact that U.S., which is one of the highest emitter countries, has been pulled out of the Paris Agreement by the current sitting president. And that, we believe, is a tragedy to the world, because when we have such a player like the US out of this Paris Agreement, and therefore not honoring any of the commitments they may have committed, it is such a big tragedy. And we are afraid that the rise of the right-wing movement is becoming really a big disadvantage in the fight, for climate, justice, across the world. And we are saying we need to see, a lot of seriousness in dealing with the climate change, and getting to see countries pulling out, especially high emitter countries, is such a big slap on the face, particularly of the communities that are mostly impacted. And we normally say climate change may not just be seen as an African problem because we have other vulnerabilities that expose us even more to this existential threat, which is climate change, because of course our poverty levels, of our poor infrastructure, and therefore climate change only comes to make this worse. But climate change is catching up with everyone. We are all in the same ship, same Titanic. But the African group could probably be seated in the lower decks. Others could be in higher decks. But the reality of the matter is when climate change hits, it's going to affect all of us. And therefore, it's our collective responsibility to act and really to deliver for the global citizens, but most importantly also for posterity.
Your interaction on this channel will be very great for us, especially your comments and also sharing this podcast to your friends will really be good. That's the support that we're asking you to do. If you want to see us in better studio than we are in today, if you want to see us with better microphone recording system, I want you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel, share as much as possible. You can also recommend individuals to us that are doing remarkable works in their various countries in youth development, in advocacy, in politics. We will try our best to bring them to this platform to discuss the critical roles that they are playing in their countries or in their national development agenda. Having said that, I want to ask you about your favorite renewable source and why do you think that is interesting? African countries should adopt to that method of renewable energy, because when we talk about climate change and people talk about doing away with the old things and new invention in terms of how we generate electricity, how we live our lives, how we make impacts on the environment. So what is your best source of energy and why?
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That Africa is endowed with many, many natural resources to the economies, to renewable energy driven economies. So we are a rich continent. Africa experiences almost a whole 12 hours of sunshine. And therefore, our solar, our capacity to generate solar, energy is not limited at all. And that is one resource we haven't really exploited. Look at the geothermal potential of many countries. If you look at a country like Kenya, for example, which is has about 80%, reliance on renewable energy, we have geothermal potential that has not even been exploited. We have geothermal energy, very small percentage that has actually been exploited. Now think about wheat. In many countries in Africa, we have wheat, and wheat can actually be tapped to produce energy that we need, to drive economic growth. But even more importantly, we have critical minerals, or what we call transition minerals, that are crucial in this journey of transitioning from dirty energy sources to renewable energy sources. And I'm talking about lithium, I'm talking about copper, I'm talking about those other critical minerals that are actually so much in the continent of Africa. But the tragedy is these resources are being exploited at a lightning speed from the continent. In fact, some of them mining areas have been concessioned until 2032. And therefore, this begs the question whether these minerals are really for Africa or they are being taken somewhere else. Look at the crisis that is currently happening in DRC. In as much as people might want to hide in political or any other gimmicks, the truth of the matter is whatever is happening around there is really a fight for control of some of the mining areas that are well endowed, mostly with these, critical minerals. And therefore, these minerals have become a tragedy for the continent, it's like a curse to the continent or for the continent, instead of functioning and working, for the continent, especially as we transition, to green energy. You might want to refresh your memory and realize that actually 630 million Africans have got no access to energy, whether dirty or clean energy. More than half of the continent really don't have access, to electricity. And we are saying electricity for the continent is crucial again for adaptation. We need cooling systems, for preservation of our agricultural, products. Remember, economies of most of the African countries is actually, based, on agriculture. But our post-harvest losses are serious because we don't have systems, to store our harvest. Again, for us to have resilient health systems, of course, we require energy, for us to be able to manage that. And without, of course, access, to power, then most of the communities remain, disadvantaged. And therefore, even as we think about this transition, we have to think about transition, from the point of access. How do you ensure that we connect the communities that are not connected to the grid, so that they can actually be able to get electricity, and electricity that is going to power, economic growth, in the regions where they stay, and for improvements, of their livelihood. So we have very, very high potential. We have all the resources, but unfortunately, like I did mention, the resources are not serving the continent pretty much because a lot of it is being stolen, a lot of it is being misused, and therefore the continent continues suffering. And beyond this, again, we have been importing raw materials, instead of processing materials, from local sources. I'm told copper coming from Zambia, and of course, lithium coming from DRC. If we're able to produce our batteries locally here, then we'd reduce the cost of, batteries by a whooping 30%, even more. And the challenge is, these minerals are actually also being exported as raw materials, and therefore that doesn't fetch enough, for the continent, and it's also leaves the continent vulnerable because when we need these minerals more than ever.
If you are just joining us, or if you are stay tuned again and you reach this far in this particular podcast, it means that you are enjoying this video. And in order for you to be able to support us and help us, is through your subscription, like it, comment it, share it, which will do us well, and it will help to boost this podcast, because our goal is to continue doing this podcast so that every African votes in the development of the African continent. And the only way we can get ourselves involved in the development of our continent is for us to have a space where young people that are making change have a platform to speak, so that our leaders and policymakers are able to listen to those young people and make policies or changes in relations to what the young people are saying. Because I believe that the young people really do appreciate some of the challenges and opportunities that the continent have. They have a greater knowledge and experiences based upon things that are happening in the continent right now. And if the young people are the future of the African continent, as the African Unions have always said, I think it is now time that the young people get involved into the development process. And one of the major ways for young people to be involved in the development process of any kind is having a space to speak. Because if you cannot express yourself adequately, no one will be able to understand what you're actually going through. Having said that, my next question has to do with Nothing Rangeland Trust. As a Kenya-based activist organization, and we've seen a lot of documentaries and information on social media, especially in recent times. Al Jazeera did a coverage on the activities of Northern Ridgeland Trust, where there are some protestation against the trust in Kenya. Some areas in which Northern Ridgeland Trust is working, people in those areas are saying that they are not benefiting from the work, and it is just about showmanship. What can you say about that? Or is your organization working with Northern Ridgeland Trust in Kenya in order to be able to come up with viable solutions related to climate justice?
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I may not want to restrict myself to discussing Northern Niger Tract as an entity, but I want to generally address that question this way. We have had quite a number of proposed solutions to deal with climate change. And one of the solutions that has been put on the table, and which is not very new, but people think it's new because now it's gaining traction, is the whole concept of carbon trading. And this carbon trading actually started a long time ago in 2006 or 2007, with the Kyoto Protocol, or Article 6, on clean development mechanism. And the idea about carbon trading was a situation that would actually give countries that are high emitter countries a leeway, to continue with their development and their emissions as other countries work towards sequestering or towards dealing with the emissions and absorbing the emissions that are being emitted by developing those countries that are fast developing, and at a cost, as a fee, so that a country A would actually continue with its manufacturing activities and produce, say, 20 tons of carbon equivalent. And then another country B, somewhere in the global south, say in Africa, would actually, for example, plant trees that would be able to sequester or to actually absorb those 20 tons of carbon equivalent. And then country A pays that country B some money for basically clearing or cleaning their mess. That is in layman language how carbon markets function. And those carbon markets during those days failed terribly, pretty much because they remained these very complicated schemes which really do not make a lot of sense, particularly to the frontline communities, such that their beneficiaries then became the countries that are emitting more, because then they would continue, the both almost both license to continue polluting as they continue, increasing their GDP, increasing their productivity, as a country, while other countries are being paid peanuts, and the peanuts in form of like 5 tons of, $5 probably per ton of carbon equivalent, and that money really also never actually even reached the communities, at the grassroots. Now, carbon trading has now come back in a big way, particularly with the coming of the Paris Agreement, and now within the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there are provisions around 6.2, 6.4, around how then this trading is supposed to happen. But countries are rushing very, very quickly into these carbon schemes, into these carbon markets, without really, first of all, analyzing and getting that clear understanding of what they're getting into, and looking at what we call cost benefit analysis to know whether these carbon programs really make sense for the communities, make sense for these countries, and whether it's they actually worth where investments. And I want to say that there are quite a number of companies that are already implementing carbon projects in various countries. And recently, we saw a number of countries rushing to commit millions of hectares of their land, whether it is pasture land or whether it's forest land, for this carbon, trading, because there is that assumption that there is money that is going to come through the same. But the challenge is, and the question that we always ask ourselves at Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, because we believe carbon, trading is basically a hoax. We believe that these are some of the four solutions to climate, change, and they actually the versionary tricks, that really are presented as ideas that would support in emission, reduction, but also in reducing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, where other countries are benefiting from the same. But I think the benefits are actually skewed. It's actually the producer of these greenhouse gas emissions that benefit more, because they'll continue developing at the expense of everyone else. If you look at the GDP, the total GDP last year in the European Union, which is about, if I'm not wrong, almost 18 trillion, euros, for that matter. If you look at that amount of, GDP vis-a-vis how much emissions that come from the European Union, which is about 2.5 billion, tons of carbon equivalent. Now, if you divide those figures, you realize that for every ton of carbon equivalent produced, the GDP in the European Union, grows by about 7,700 and some figures, actually close to 8,000, euros for that matter. And if you look at how much 1 ton of carbon equivalent is therefore sold in the market, for example, and I'm just using figures that are general figures, you realize that if 1 ton of carbon equivalent is going to be paid for $5, it means that for every almost 8,000 dollars or euros, that are produced, in the European Union, it's only about 5% then that is paid to the person who is clearing the mess, the person who is absorbing that 1 ton of carbon equivalent. So therefore, I know Northern Nigeria Trust and others are implementing, carbon projects, but the biggest question that we always do ask ourselves is then how much of these resources actually reach the communities at the grassroots. The little amount of money that comes from the sale of carbon credits, how much of it does it actually reach the communities, and it reaches in which form? You realize that, and not talking about Northern Trust, but generally talking about the investors in that particular regard, and there are many of them, you realize that these, products normally get, or benefits get the communities, in form of probably community projects like schools, like hospitals, and so on and so forth. But then sometimes people don't even account how much is that per capita. if you have invested in a certain particular school, probably, so how much is that, per every head that is around, that particular area? And you realize that sometimes the cost of investing in some of these carbon projects really is not commensurate, to the product. I mean, to the money that actually accrue or profits that from this kind of investments. And that is why you realize that sometimes there are conflicts, within societies, within communities, because of those benefit sharing mechanisms. But again, because the prices of, carbon equivalent really is not as much as you'd actually expect, considering the investments, considering the foregone opportunities. Because when some of these past runs, are actually controlled in a certain way because the carbon projects are running, and therefore communities don't have an opportunity probably to utilize them as much as they would if one of those particular carbon projects. That's what we call, foregone, opportunities in those particular pieces of land. So those could be some of the reasons as why there are conflicts, within some of these areas and some of these investors. But I think the problem is much bigger than the proponents of this particular initiative. The biggest problem is, the markets. These markets are not necessarily giving or paying off the way they're supposed to pay off, because they're developing a lot through these emissions, but they don't want to pay, a lot in terms of paying, for sequestration, or basically for removals of those emissions that are actually in the atmosphere, and which other countries are being paid in the peanuts to be able to clear from the atmosphere.
Thank you very much. We have come to our end of today's podcast. But before we take a leave of our guest, I'd like to encourage each and every one of you to please be a supporter of this YouTube channel by liking, commenting, sharing, as well as recommended individuals to us that are doing remarkable works in their various countries in youth development, economic participation, activism, climate justice. We will try our best to bring them to this platform to discuss the critical roles that they are playing in their national development. Today's video is proudly sponsored by Magnite to the brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page or on their website. All of the links are in the description of this video.